Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm the Dog of Elazi, and just before we start, I'd like to invite you to check out our new and improved website, where you can find all of our latest content and events from the heart of the State of Israel. So please check it out and subscribe to ILTV.tv. And now, coming up in today's newscast. Iran has been ousted from the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women over its brutal crackdown on the women's rights protests. The Israel Defense Forces releasing new photos providing proof that terrorist organization Hamas has positioned its rocket launch sites in Gaza next to several schools. And celebrations across France as the defending World Cup champions defeated underdog Morocco 2-0 to reach Sunday's anticipated final against Argentina. Iran suffering a major diplomatic blow in the United Nations. This as the world body's leading forum on women's rights ejected the Islamic State for its brutal crackdown on protests, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini in September. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
Iran was ousted from the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women for policies contrary to the rights of women and girls. The move was proposed by the United States after Tehran's brutal crackdown on protests, sparked by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was arrested by morality police enforcing the Islamic Republic's mandatory dress code and died in custody.
The Iranian government wants nothing more than to wiggle its way out of this vote, to use misinformation and procedural tricks to obscure the truth and avoid accountability. But today, I urge you to keep this simple. We have Iranian women and activists here in the room with us right now. Let's do right by them. Let's do right by women and girls around the world.
Israel supported the motion, and UN Ambassador Gilad Erdan compared Iran to history's worst regime.
The regime in Iran represents the embodiment of evil, just as Hitler's Nazi regime represented the embodiment of evil. The Iranian Ayatollahs are already responsible for the destruction of 4 Middle Eastern countries. They supply suicide drones for the murder of innocent Ukrainians. They attack the cyber infrastructure of Albania. They murder innocent Kurds in Iraq. They endanger global maritime trade routes. And they publicly threaten another member states of the UN with annihilation.
The 54-member UN Economic and Social Council adopted the resolution to remove Iran for the remainder of its 2022-2026 term. 29 voted in favor, 8 against, and there were 16 abstentions. The U.S. ambassador spoke of the vote's meaning.
So today we came together at the United Nations and stood with Iranian women, Iranian girls, and the Iranian people. Following the death of Mahsa Amini, tens of thousands of Iranians said, enough is enough. The people have taken to the streets and made their voices heard. They're standing for women, for life, and for freedom. The Iranian government has responded with brutality and with violence.
Meanwhile, in Iran, a second public hanging in less than a week, this time of a man convicted of killing 2 members of the security forces during the protests. Amnesty International says authorities are seeking the death penalty for at least 21 people in what it called sham trials. The demonstrations have turned into a popular revolt by furious Iranians from all layers of society, posing one of the most significant legitimacy challenges to the Shiite clerical elite since the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
And so joining us now with more on the UN vote and its implications is Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of United Nations Watch. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you here in the studio.
My pleasure.
So what are the implications of this historic vote, Iran being ousted from the UN's women's rights group?
Look, this has never happened before. So we're looking at something that is historic in the entire history of the United Nations. A member state has never before been removed from the UN Women's Rights Commission. It's a major slap in the face for the Islamic regime, for the Ayatollah Khamenei, the dictator. The world has said, you are shameless. There is a cry in Iran of the people. They say, Bisharaf, you are shameless. You have no honor. You have no dignity. You have no conscience. You have no morals. You are shameless. Bisharaf. That is what the world yesterday, for the first time at the United Nations, said to Khamenei, said to the Islamic regime, said to the murderous mullahs. And it's a very important message and a signal that was sent from the world. It gives great strength. There were celebrations in the town where Mahsa Amini, the young woman who was beaten and killed while in police custody, there were fireworks immediately after the vote. So a very important message was sent. I want to be clear, there is no concrete action that happened yesterday that will save the people in Iran who are being beaten, blinded, tortured, raped, killed by the regime. This doesn't help them do that, but it is the beginning. We see this as the beginning of the world mobilizing and sending the right message for maybe the first time.
So before we look ahead, I do want to take a step back. You know, your organization was the first to sort of break the story about Iran joining the council in the first place. Can you give us maybe a little bit of a behind the scenes? What happened, from that moment until the vote to oust Iran?
Look, the election that happened last year, April 20th, 2021, was an abomination. It was a travesty. It should never have happened. Sadly, at the United Nations, there is something rotten in the culture of the United Nations. There is a kind of moral bankruptcy, a moral corruption, where it's a regular thing that the worst dictatorships get elected. They seek election for reasons of propaganda, to protect their records of abuse. They seek election to the world's highest human rights bodies, and very often they win. That's what happened in April 2021. Iran was elected with 43 out of 54 votes. Only 11 didn't vote for them. We know it was a secret ballot. So we don't know which countries at the time voted for Iran, but at least four EU and Western countries voted for Iran. That's the cynical back and forth where diplomats go along to get along at the UN. UN Watch was the first organization to break the story. There was silence. No news agency reported it. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the largest, wealthiest NGOs, they were silent. We were not silent. We exposed it and we said, this is outrageous. It has to be reversed. We created a firestorm in parliaments in Europe, in Canada, in the United States. We demanded to know who voted for the Islamic Republic. Reveal your secret ballots. They didn't want to reveal the ballot. The Canadian ambassador, I salute him, Bob Ray, he immediately said, we did not vote for Iran. And yesterday he gave the most powerful rejoinder to those who argued that they should not be removed. He said, can it really be that a country can do whatever it wants against women and yet have no consequences for them being on a Women's Rights Commission? And, we campaigned throughout the past year and a half. We had caricatures in Geneva, Switzerland, the headquarters of the UN Human Rights System. We had an entire train of a tram plastered with the words, expel Iran from the Women's Rights Commission. And we had tweets and videos and a website. And we had a diplomatic campaign. And there were other activists in Geneva and New York who pressed it. And it was a worldwide effort. People like Nazanin Afshinjam, people like Nazanin Boniadi, Masih Alinejad, the hero of the women's rights movement, she said from the beginning, this is surreal. And it took, sadly, the death of Mahsa Amini, hundreds of other protesters, women being shot in the back for this to happen. And finally, we had justice yesterday.
Now, this is the first time, as you mentioned, that any country has been ejected, from a council. Could this perhaps mark a change within the UN?
We hope so. But I need to be realistic. There is a long-standing practice where at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where I'm based, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, Libya, Qatar, they sit on the Human Rights Council. Only twice in the history of the past 2 decades were evil dictatorships removed. In both cases, campaigns that we spearheaded. Gaddafi in 2011, Vladimir Putin this year in April. Those are the exceptions. The rule is the dictatorships seek election, and our democracies do very little to stop them. In rare occasions, they do intervene, and they can stop them. And we see today that Vladimir Putin was removed. The U.S. took action. Yesterday, Iran was removed because the U.S. took action. But it's rare. So unfortunately, to be realistic, I cannot anticipate that other dictatorships will be removed. It should happen.
And so, looking ahead, what's next in terms of Iran at the UN and other dictatorships and countries?
Yeah, sadly, many UN human rights bodies are filled with dictatorships. The Human Rights Council, the highest human rights body at the United Nations, has 70%, according to Freedom House, 70% of their members are either outright dictatorships or various other kinds of authoritarian regimes. That is why when the United States introduced a resolution just a few months ago to have a debate on 1 million Muslim Uyghurs herded into camps by the Chinese Communist Party, it failed. They couldn't even get a debate. Most of the worst regimes in the world have impunity. There's never been a resolution at the Human Rights Council on Pakistan, on Cuba, on China, on Saudi Arabia. Most of the world's worst regimes get a free pass. That has to end. I'm glad to see that the U.S. is trying to make changes. The U.S. ambassador in Geneva is trying to hold China to account. And I continue to urge the U.S. government to take leadership at the UN.
All right, Hillel Neuer, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this very important issue today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And moving on, Israel has taken credit for an airstrike in early November on a convoy carrying Iranian arms near the Syria-Iraq border. We get more from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi made the rare confirmation of an Israeli Air Force strike on the 25-vehicle convoy. Israeli intelligence uncovered which truck in the convoy was carrying Iranian weapons after it crossed into Syria from Iraq. Pilots had to evade surface-to-air missiles fired at them. The strike reportedly killed 10 people, including an unknown number of Iranians.
יכולנו לא לדעת לפני מספר שבועות על השיירה הסורית שעוברת מעיראק לסוריה. יכולנו לא לדעת מה יש בה, ויכולנו לא לדעת שמתוך 25 מסעיות, זאת המסעית, מסעית מספר 8, היא המסעית עם האמל"ח. וגם לשם צריך לשלוח את הטייסים, הם צריכים לדעת להתחמק מטילי הקרקע האוויר.
At the time of the incident, the IDF refused to comment in line with its policy of not confirming specific strikes in Syria. Israel has acknowledged carrying out hundreds of strikes on targets inside Syria in recent years, targeting arms shipments of Iranian allied groups, including Lebanon's terrorist Hezbollah. Israeli strikes continue in Syrian airspace, largely controlled by Russia, even as ties between Jerusalem and Moscow are at odds over Israel's support for Ukraine since the Russian invasion.
And pivoting from one terror regime to another, the Israel Defense Forces has released photos providing proof that terrorist organization Hamas has positioned rocket launch sites in Gaza next to several schools. Steve Leibowitz reporting. The IDF released satellite images showing rocket launchers adjacent to 3 schools in Gaza City, attended by over 1,000 students. The army said that Hamas intentionally places students in harm's way to act as human shields. The IDF added that the exposure comes approximately 2 weeks after UNRWA reported that the ground of one of its schools had collapsed. The army said the collapse was caused by the construction of a Hamas terrorist tunnel. Meanwhile, Hamas's leadership staged a mass armed march on Wednesday to mark the terror organization's 35th anniversary, meant to display its open confrontation with Israel. Tens of thousands took part in the march, and its leader left no doubt that the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas will continue. Sinwar said the Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem, a site revered by both Jews and Muslims, was threatened with encroachment by the, quote, Talmudic fascist Zionist rightist government, referring to Israel's soon-to-be-installed new right-wing government, and said Hamas would respond with force. Israel and Hamas fought a 10-day battle that ended in a ceasefire more than a year ago. Since then, the area has remained largely quiet. And moving on to politics, Prime Minister-designate Benjamin Netanyahu only days away from the deadline to finalize a coalition. In the meantime, the soon-to-be coalition proposing new legislation in the Knesset, but receiving some pushback from critics. The details in the following report. Legal advisors to Israel's Knesset or parliament pushed back against new legislation by Otzma Yehudit party leader Itamar Ben-Gvir on Wednesday. Under a coalition deal with incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir was promised the National Security Ministry, with authority over Israel's police. Though the coalition has yet to be finalized, Ben-Gvir has submitted a bill that would amend police regulations and grant him greater control over the police chief and over police investigations. Critics of the bill have said his proposed changes could politicize police probes and prosecutions. However, Ben-Gvir has defended the bill as consolidating a chain of command between the government and the police. In a Knesset committee meeting on the legislation, Ben-Gvir received some opposition from Israel's police chief and the Attorney General's office.
אני מנסה להבין מה הצעת החוק משנה, ועל מנת שנוכל לגבש עמדה מקצועית ורצינית ביחס לשינוי המוצע.
מדיניות, הסברתי לך כבר את זה, מדיניות.
השר רשאי להתערב בהחלטות אסטרטגיות, לתת הנחיות כלליות ולהתוות את מדיניות המשטרה בעניינים בעלי חשיבות עקרונית, אבל הוא אינו רשאי להתערב בפרטי הביצוע האופרטיבי של המדיניות.
Following the committee meeting, Israel's Hebrew media reported that Ben-Gvir was open to making some amendments to the bill to ensure broader support. Meanwhile, the coalition deadline just days away, and Netanyahu reportedly very close to finalizing his government and signing a deal with ultra-Orthodox parties. And joining us now with more on politics is Alex Treiman, Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate. Alex, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the Knesset, with the new Likud speaker Yariv Levin, is in a marathon effort to pass several laws that make it, possible to meet all of the coalition agreements. Is this a normal situation, and are we likely to see these laws pass since they have a clear majority?
Good. There's two good questions there. So the first is that this really is not a normal scenario. Usually the Knesset speaker would be installed simultaneous to the installation of the government. As yet, the coalition agreements have not been signed. However, the coalition does possess a majority in the parliament, and they were able to elect a new speaker. And they've done so in order to put a few laws on the table which would enable the coalition partners to get their agenda fulfilled before, or at least parts of their agenda fulfilled before the coalition is actually formed. And it's definitely not necessarily a normal situation, considering that it looked like there was going to be a very clear process towards the formation of a coalition with Netanyahu's right-wing coalition partners.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you give us a quick rundown of some of the more sort of noteworthy bills that the soon-to-be coalition has basically put forth?
Sure. So the first revolves around Aryeh Deri, who is the head of Shas, his suitability to serve as a minister in the government. He was convicted of crimes, for tax crimes, actually, but his sentence was suspended. And so the current law does not relate specifically to whether someone with a suspended sentence can serve as a minister. So the law actually needs a clarification. And so one of the laws would be to clarify that someone with a suspended sentence could serve as a minister when someone who had actually served in prison for that crime would not have been able to serve as a minister. So obviously Deri, the head of the Shas party, wants to be the minister. He would be the interior minister and the health minister. So that law needs to be clarified before Deri could be appointed. The second revolves around Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's demanded that the powers given to the national security minister, the public security minister, would actually be enhanced to allow for the minister itself to be the one who sets the policies over the police. This came up in a contentious Knesset debate yesterday. And another law, it relates to incoming finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, whose coalition demand would be that the governance in the territories of Judea and Samaria, which are currently folded under the Ministry of Defense, would actually be removed from the Ministry of Defense, which would enable another minister in the government to control policy in Judea and Samaria, and also remove the civil administration and the coordinator of government activities in the territories to be removed from the Ministry of Defense.
And are these laws, again, are they likely to be passed now that they have a majority in the government, in the Knesset?
So in terms of their ability to pass through the parliament, yes, the incoming coalition will vote in favor of those laws. The only question is whether or not those laws would sustain a challenge either from the Attorney General or the Supreme Court, and if those laws could be overturned after they were passed. And don't forget that the Supreme Court in Israel can overturn legislation. So the question is whether those laws will hold, not whether they might pass an initial vote.
Now, the coalition deadline just a few days away. I mean, what can you tell us about the progress being made? New reports saying that Netanyahu is close to signing with United Torah Judaism, but will give up mandatory service for ultra-Orthodox. I mean, what can you tell us about this?
Well, that's definitely one of the demands here for United Torah Judaism. They have very limited constituency that they care deeply about, and that's why you're seeing all of these legislation being brought up to deal with the specific constituencies or the specific demands of the parties. And I think that it's pretty obvious to everybody that United Torah Judaism does not want to see mandatory conscription of the individuals that are ultra-Orthodox and or prefer not to serve in the military. I think that there's going to be numerous changes that would have to happen inside the military itself in order to make it easier to convince ultra-Orthodox males to go serve in the army. That should become easier for them to be able to learn Torah and guard the nation simultaneously. And until those types of changes occur, I think you're going to have difficulty getting the two sides to agree.
You know, and now many critics, and even some within the Likud, saying that Netanyahu is making too many compromises in order to secure a coalition. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the thing that Netanyahu has had to deal with for the last many years has been instability in governance. And if demands come up throughout the process of governance, that can erode the stability of the coalition and make it fall. And here, Netanyahu has partners that are actually very transparent about what their demands are, and they're putting them forward up front. And so if Netanyahu is able to accomplish and satisfy the demands of his partners from the beginning, I think that it puts him in position to be able to govern very stable, from a place of stability over possibly a complete term, which would be 4.5 years. And so for Netanyahu, making these concessions at this point actually does make a lot of sense, and can give him 4.5 years to govern without worrying about going to a new election.
All right, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and we'll continue to keep you viewers updated on the latest in politics.
Thanks for having me.
Now, celebration erupted across France last night after the defending World Cup champions defeated Morocco 2-0 to reach Sunday's much-anticipated final against Argentina. It was a hard-fought match. The underdog Morocco gave the champions all they could handle, but it wasn't enough.
Les Bleus, et on vous aime, et on va gagner cette Coupe du Monde. Voilà, troisième étoile, regarde. Troisième, n'en manque une. Ouais, je sais bien, c'est à 14-18 là. Allez, Bleus. Allez.
Morocco's defeat was tempered by excellent play after becoming the first African and Arab country to reach a World Cup semifinal. On Saturday, they play for third place against Croatia. Arab soccer fans across the Middle East expressed disappointment, but were still pumped with pride for a World Cup run that spurred tears of joy across Africa and the Arab world.
يعني احنا بصراحة النهاردة المغاربة أدوا ماتش رائع وكفاية إن هم وصلوا المربع الذهبي، ما فيش أي دولة عربية ولا أفريقية وصلت للمرحلة دي، ويعني مش عارف نقول إيه والله، يعني غير هم أبطال والله المغاربة، وادي أحلى ديديكاس للشعب المغربي.
The World Cup in Qatar comes to a close on Sunday evening with the highly anticipated final between France and Argentina. And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Partly cloudy skies expected around the country tonight, with lows this evening averaging a chilly 10 degrees Celsius or 50 Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow, the forecast calling for clear skies and warmer temperatures with highs of 23 Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And finally, on Saturday, we can expect more clear skies with temperatures remaining steadily in the mid-20s. That's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channels on YouTube, Facebook, and Telegram. Subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, ILTV.tv, with all the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm the Dargave Lazi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.